لا يزال الخير حيا لا يزال إن في الدنيا سلاما وظلال أخبر الأيام أنها في وصال قم بنا وانظر لآيات الجمال قم بنا وانظر لآيات الجمال كن كما غيث
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah ma ba'd. In today's lecture, inshallah ta'ala, just wanted to shed some light about some of the past epidemics that have occurred in the Muslim Ummah and how some of our classical ulama and also our pre-modern ulama have dealt with some of these issues so that we can inshallah ta'ala benefit from their experiences and see what we can do in our times. Now, of course, we all know that epidemics and pandemics are things that have been a part of human nature, human history since the beginning of time. An epidemic, by the way, is the rapid spread of a disease to a large number of people in a short period of time. If it spreads to much of the globe, it is called a pandemic. And of course, historically, there have been many epidemics, many dozens, if not hundreds of epidemics. And where an epidemic becomes a pandemic is a bit of a gray area. But I think we should all be aware that there were a number of pandemics in our history. The two most famous ones, I would say, in the last 1,000 years, everybody should know. Of course, the most famous and without a doubt, the most devastating plague that ever inflicted human history, or at least I should say recorded human history, is of course the infamous Black Death or the Black Plague that lasted from 1331 up until roughly 1350, 1360 or so. And in this time frame, it is estimated that at least 200 million people worldwide were killed over the course of the 13th and maybe even up until the 14th century. It is said that Europe took 2 centuries to recover to its normal and to get back the population that had been lost. And that's of course the infamous Black Death plague. It also affected Muslim lands, as we're going to see. And a number of ulama many ulama died in this plague, in the Black Death. And a number of ulama, they lost family members, and they actually wrote treatises and they wrote scholarly articles about plagues that I'm going to mention in today's lecture. The second infamous pandemic that everybody should be familiar with is the pandemic that took place around 100 years ago of 1918, in which it is estimated maybe up to 100 million people lost their lives. And the fact that it was exacerbated by World War I. And I was saying that the reason why it's called the Spanish influenza is not because it originated in Spain, but because America and Canada and England, they control the media and they didn't allow the news of the virus to spread too much because they were worried about how it might be used as propaganda. Spain was a neutral country and Spain mentioned everything about the virus and everybody who's dying and whatnot. And so people assumed that it was worse in Spain, even though it wasn't worse in Spain. And so it was called the Spanish influenza. Interestingly enough, the Spanish influenza, the virus of the Spanish influenza, it is in the same family of viruses that we are now dealing with now, the coronavirus or COVID-19 it is called. By the way, as for the virus of the Black Plague, it is still being discussed and academically, I'm not an expert, but from what I briefly read, we're not 100% sure about the actual virus, but it is also most likely from the same family of viruses that we are currently facing. Now, my point, of course, in today's lecture is not to go down that tangent. It is to talk about how our ulama historically have looked at these plagues and what have they written in their fatwa and a bit of some of the controversies that occurred in the past. And I want to begin, obviously it's one lecture, this is worthy of many PhD dissertations and many books have been written and many more can be written. My purpose today is really just a bird's eye view, miscellaneous anecdotes and various issues and circumstances that inshallah we can benefit from. And if Allah wills, I might give more lectures about this issue because it is an interesting topic in and of itself and it becomes extremely relevant given the current circumstances we find ourselves in. Of course, all lectures that you've heard about plagues, they begin with the first plague that occurred in the Muslim Ummah, and that is the famous Plague of Amwas, or sometimes called Amwas or Imwas, and is named after a city, Emmaus, Emmaus, Emmaus. And this was the first major plague that occurred in the Ummah. And the Amwas plagues, or the Amwas plagues, they were some of the remnants of what are called the Justinian plagues that began in the Roman Empire from 541 CE to 750 CE. And it came in multiple batches, and of course, in the Emperor Justinian's time, that's why it's called the Justinian plague. And at one point in time, it was killing over 10,000 people a day in the city of Constantinople. And the Ta'un Amwas was one of the iterations that occurred towards the end, not under Emperor Justinian, but after the time of the Prophet ﷺ in the 18th year of the Hijrah. And the story, as I'm sure you have heard from many of my fellow colleagues and speakers have spoken about this in more detail. I wasn't able to give a lengthy lecture, nor am I going to do it today, but I'm just going to summarize some aspects of that before we move on to other examples. In this time frame, in the 18th year of the Hijrah, the Muslims, the Sahaba, were busy conquering the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and in particular Bilad al-Sham. And in particular, in this time frame, they've conquered Jerusalem, they've conquered Damascus. There's active battles being waged between the Muslims on one side and the Byzantine forces on the other. And the Amwas plague, of course, it doesn't just affect the Muslim side, it affects the Byzantine side as well. And the leader of the Muslim forces in the entire region was Abu Ubaidah Amir ibn al-Jarrah, one of the 10 Sahaba promised Jannah. And Umar ibn al-Khattab had placed Abu Ubaidah as the supreme commander or the leader of all of the Muslim forces. And Abu Ubaidah had requested reinforcements. And Umar ibn al-Khattab decided to lead one batch of reinforcements and bring one batch and give them over to Abu Ubaidah and head back to Medina. As he's on his way from Medina to Bilad al-Sham, he hears of the plague. And we now go to the hadith in Sahih Bukhari. This is a hadith in Sahih Bukhari that Umar ibn al-Khattab kharaja ila Sham. He went to Bilad al-Sham, the land of Syria. And when he reached Saragh, which is a city that is in between Hijaz and Sham. So he is not yet inside Sham. He is on the borders of Bilad al-Sham. Abu Ubaidah came out from Damascus to meet him. Abu Ubaidah was excited that Umar ibn al-Khattab is coming, so he came out to meet him, and that was when they heard of the news of the plague that had afflicted inside Sham. So they differed. What should they do? And so Ibn Abbas mentions that the Umar ibn al-Khattab sent him. Ibn Abbas was with Umar. Ibn Abbas sent him and said, bring me the early muhajirun. Bring me the first batch of muhajirun. So he called them into his tent. He asked them, there is now a plague in Bilad al-Sham, and we haven't yet reached there. Should we go into the plague and fight the Byzantine, or should we go back to Medina and not enter the plague? So they began differing amongst themselves. Some of them said, we have come in order to wage war against the Byzantines, and so we should not go back until we have waged war against them. And others said, you have with you some of the elite of the Sahaba. Why would you enter a land of plague and cause all of this issue? Let's go back to Medina and protect these elite of the Sahaba. We don't think it is wise to go into the land of the plague. So when they differed amongst themselves, Umar said, you may excuse yourselves. Then he said to Ibn Abbas, bring me the Ansar. And so he called the Ansar. The same thing happened, exact same two opinions, debate back and forth, raising of voices. So Umar ibn Khattab said, you may excuse yourselves. Then he said to Ibn Abbas, bring me Mashiyakhatu Quraysh min Muhajarat al-Fatah. Bring me the senior elders of the Quraysh who made hijrah after the conquest of Mecca. So bring me the elders, the senior members of the Quraysh, who were of those who emigrated after the conquest of Mecca. And so a much smaller group is coming, and these are older people because they're Mashiyakhatu Quraysh. And when Umar ibn al-Khattab asked this third group, they were not from the early Muhajirun, they were not from the Ansar, they were from the third batch. When he asked them, no two people differed amongst them. They all reached a unanimous consensus and they said, we don't think that you should take this group of people and enter the plague. We don't think so. We should go back to Medina. So Umar ibn al-Khattab then made the announcement and he said, I have decreed that tomorrow when we wake up, we're going to head back to Medina. Abu Ubaidah, Amir ibn al-Jarrah, became disappointed and he said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, are you running away from the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Are you running away from Allah's qadr? If Allah's qadr is that we're going to face death, if Allah's qadr is there's going to be a plague, why would you run away? And Umar ibn al-Khattab was disappointed and he said, Oh Abu Ubaidah, how I wish someone else has said this phrase other than you. In other words, I hold you in such high esteem. I have so much respect for you. You saying this phrase, it hurts me because I don't expect someone at your level to make this phrase. Oh Abu Ubaidah, if only somebody else has said this. We are not running away from the decree of Allah except to meet the decree of Allah. In other words, we are running from the decree of Allah to the decree of Allah. Then he gave an example and he said that, let me ask you, if you took your flock and you saw, and you wanted to feed, you wanted to basically graze your flock, and you saw a valley that was very green and very fertile, and you saw another valley that was barren, and you have it now. Basically what he's saying is, would you not choose the flock that, would you not choose the valley that is barren? Would you not choose, not barren, would you not choose the valley that is green? In other words, you have a group of sheep, a flock of sheep, and you want to now graze this flock of sheep. Are you going to choose the barren valley or are you going to choose the fertile valley? And are you then going to say, oh, it's Allah's qadr? No, you're going to choose the fertile valley and you will say, Allah gave me a choice and the qadr was that I chose the right one, and that is of course qadr. So this is the point of the analogy that he is basically saying that, look, we are not running away from the qadr of Allah. We are choosing the qadr of Allah. It is the qadr of Allah. Allah wants us to make the wise decision, and this wise decision is indeed going to be in accordance with Allah's qadr. Now, before the army departed, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, also one of the 10 promised Jannah, he was away on an errand. He came back. He heard everything that had happened, and he said, hey, I have something directly from the Prophet ﷺ that resolves all of this. I have knowledge directly from the Prophet ﷺ. So they said, what is it? He said, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say that if the plague comes and you are in the land, then do not leave that land, running away from it. And if you are not in that land, then do not enter the land of the plague. So Umar ibn al-Khattab thanked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for having blessed him with the correct decision, and then hearing the hadith that of course affirms his decision. Now, this hadith is in Sahih Bukhari and it is reported in many books of hadith. There are many, many benefits derived from this famous incident about the plague of Amwas, the plague of Amwas. Of them is that the senior companions themselves were conflicted about the best course of action. Of them, the Muhajirun and the Ansar did not reach unanimity. What should be done? Some of them are saying this, others are saying that. Of them as well is that one of the greatest of the Sahaba, Abu Ubaidah Amir ibn al-Jarrah, he is one of the 10 promised Jannah. That is the highest maqam of all of the Sahaba, is the 10 promised Jannah. That he felt that piety was to go into the land of the plagues, and that to go away from the land of the plagues was somehow not the proper theology, was not something that should be done, because there's something that goes against the qadar. And that's why Umar radiallahu anhu was disappointed. He said, how I wish somebody else has said this. Now, the fact that he said this does not negate his piety. His piety is at one level, his opinion is something else. Piety does not make the correct opinion. Abu Ubaidah is one of the 10 promised Jannah, but his understanding in this particular issue was something that the other Sahaba did not agree with, and it turned out to be the incorrect one compared to what the other Sahaba said. Also, notice over here, and this is very, very important and it needs to be said. The first two groups of people, the Muhajirun and the Ansar, occupy the highest level in terms of piety. The third level in this group would be the last batch of converts, those who converted at the conquest of Mecca. Allah says in the Quran, لا يستوي منكم من أنفق من قبل الفتح وقاتل. Those who accepted Islam before the conquest are not the same as those who accepted Islam after the conquest. Those who accepted before the conquest have a higher daraja in Allah. This is explicit in the Quran. So the daraja is for the Muhajirun and then the Ansar, and then number 3, the very lowest are those who converted after the conquest of Mecca. Now, this is one thing. Their correctness of opinion has nothing to do with taqwa. The Muhajirun and the Ansar have more taqwa than those who embraced Islam after the conquest of Mecca. That taqwa did not give them the correct position. That has nothing to do. You can be the most muttaqi person and you will get the higher place in Jannah. It doesn't mean your opinion about a political issue or about a medicinal issue or about an epidemic issue is going to be valid. The Muhajirun and the Ansar had two opinions. Then when Umar ibn al-Khattab brought in the third category, and what were their two conditions? Mashyakatu Quraysh. They are from the senior level, the ones who were the ministers in the days of Jahiliyyah, right? These are the elders who did not accept Islam until Mecca was conquered. That batch who has what? Wisdom, experience, seniority of age, knowing how to control people. They have something that the people who were of the Muhajirun and the Ansar, generally speaking, did not have. They had policy knowledge. They had knowledge of what is called siyasa, or what is called basically pragmatic knowledge. When they were brought in, guess what? There was no difference of opinion. They all agreed, even though in terms of iman and taqwa, they don't occupy the same status as the muhajirun al-awwal, the awail, or the ansar. Because as we know from the Quran very clearly, وَالْمُهَاجِرِينَ وَالْأَنصَارِ وَالَّذِينَ تَبَعُوهُمْ بِإِحْسَانٍ. The highest level is the muhajirun, and then the ansar, and then those who followed them with ihsan. It was the third group, the ones who embraced after the conquest, who actually got the right answer. And again, this is really, really important, because when we say a policy and a person of iman and taqwa disagrees, and they might be right or wrong, their iman and taqwa has nothing to do with the correctness of the policy. This is on one angle and one aspect, and the policy is another aspect. Policies don't come from iman and taqwa. They come from experience and from worldly knowledge. And this is what we find even in this narration. And subhanallah, then what happens? Actual knowledge comes that demonstrates the wisdom of policy knowledge. And this is the famous hadith that we now know of Abdurrahman ibn Auf. And it was Allah's qadr. He wanted to demonstrate this is being played out, because Allah's qadr wants to demonstrate here that indeed actual knowledge of this dunya is never going to conflict with the knowledge of this religion. The two are always in harmony. What Allah has revealed and what science and what we learn from medicine that is a fact, they can never contradict one another. And we show this in this hadith here. When Abdurrahman ibn Auf came, and he is also one of the 10 promised Jannah, he says, hey guys, hold on a sec. I heard from the Prophet exactly about this issue, and I'm going to narrate to you a hadith that you guys obviously haven't heard, because if you had heard it, you wouldn't be debating. And he then tells them the hadith that solves the whole problem. And Umar ibn Khattab says, Alhamdulillah, who guided me to the correct opinion. This guidance to the correct opinion, it occurred before he knew the actual hadith. And this demonstrates as well, as we said, that the correct opinions, now imagine what would we do if Abdurrahman ibn Auf had not come, and if this hadith, if Allah had willed that it was not mentioned to us, the position that Umar would have followed would have been the same as that is mentioned in the hadith of Abdurrahman ibn Auf. And that is why Umar praised Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Umar ibn Khattab returned to Medina. The plague gets worse and worse, but still it hasn't affected the army directly. It's in the surrounding areas, and Umar ibn Khattab is scared of losing Abu Ubaidah Amir ibn al-Jarrah, because Abu Ubaidah was an effective leader, and Abu Ubaidah was one of the 10 promised Jannah. And Umar was very, very concerned, what am I going to do if I lose Abu Ubaidah? And so, as soon as he got back to Medina, maybe a month or two later, he wrote a letter, and he sent it to Abu Ubaidah. And he said, hey, Abu Ubaidah, something very important has transpired in Medina, and I need to speak to you mushafahatan, face to face, and I need you to come back immediately. And so, do not even allow this letter to leave your hand until you have begun preparations to return to Medina, right? So Umar ibn al-Khattab, he did not explicitly say why, but in his heart, what he wanted was that Abu Ubaidah not be affected by that plague and be saved in Medina, so that he could then be used him in a future battle and in a future procedure. When Abu Ubaidah got the letter, Abu Ubaidah understood that Umar ibn al-Khattab really did not have any actual need. There's no crisis going on. There's nothing. He just wants him to come back so that he doesn't have to face the plague. So Abu Ubaidah then replied back, and he said, I am amongst the army over here, and I find peace being over here, and I have no desire to leave them until Allah decides and decrees what is going to happen. So I ask of you, I beg of you to relieve me of the command of the letter. O Amir al-Mu'mineen, don't force me to come back and allow me to stay with the army. So Abu Ubaidah responds back and says, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, please don't force me, allow me to remain. Let Allah decide that if I'm going to live or die, let it happen over here. And so when Umar ibn al-Khattab, the messenger, came and said, here is the reply, he opened it up. Umar ibn al-Khattab began crying in public, and everybody knew the letter is from Abu Ubaidah, or from the camp of Abu Ubaidah. So they said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, what happened? Why are you crying? Has Abu Ubaidah died? And Umar ibn al-Khattab said, no, but he might as well have. Meaning, no, but it's going to happen. In his heart, he felt, that's it now, it is too late. And of course, that is exactly what happened, that within the camps of the Muslims, the plague began to spread, the Amwas plague, or the Justinian plagues, or the iterations of the Justinian plague. And eventually Abu Ubaidah, his army began to fall man by man. He stood up to give a khutbah, and he said that, O people, this plague, this disease, it is a rahmah from Allah. Do not get irritated by it. It is a rahmah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is the dua of your Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Well, our scholars have differed. What did he mean? It is a dua. Some say it is a prediction. And it is true, the Prophet predicted there's going to be a calamity that will take many of you. And many people interpreted this to mean the plague of Amwas. Or others have said it is the dua of your Prophet, meaning it is the dua of shahada. Because our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, as I shall mention in a short while, and we've already should know this by now, that whoever dies in a plague dies a shaheed. So Abu Ubaidah is saying, this is the dua of your Prophet ﷺ, that we should die as a shaheed, so we will die as a shaheed. So back to the Abu Ubaidah. O people, this disease is a rahmah from your Lord, and it is the dua of your Prophet ﷺ, and it is the way that the salihin, the righteous, they died before you. And I, Abu Ubaidah, am asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give me a share of all of this. In other words, he is asking Allah to be afflicted by the plague so that he dies the death of a shaheed. And soon after this, and of course he is one of the 10 promised Jannah, and his du'as are at a higher level than ours. So soon after this, he caught the disease, and he was on his deathbed, and he appointed Mu'adh bin Jabal to be in charge, and he passed away. And he was buried in a place that is still known to this day, in a village in Bilad al-Sham. It is still known to this day. So Mu'adh bin Jabal then took charge. And he barely lasted, according to some reports, even less than a month, maybe even a week or two. And he as well made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to indirectly making dua to grant him as well the death of a shaheed. And Mu'adh bin Jabal, in front of his eyes, by the way, his son as well died, and other family members of his died. And Mu'adh bin Jabal as well, he gave a very moving sermon, which is reported in the books of history. And then he as well, on his deathbed, he knew he was about to die. He appointed Amr ibn al-As, and and then he passed away. And by the way, Abu Ubaidah is one of the 10 promised Jannah. And Mu'adh ibn Jabal, our Prophet ﷺ praised him by saying, he is the one who knows haram and halal the best of my ummah. And Mu'adh ibn Jabal was that companion whom the Prophet ﷺ, the only companion that we know of, that the Prophet ﷺ, he accompanied outside the city, and Mu'adh was on the mount, and the Prophet ﷺ was walking, and they're just the two of them, and he turns to him and he says, Ya Mu'adh, inni la uhibbuk. Oh Mu'adh, I love you for the sake of Allah. Our Prophet ﷺ said this to Mu'adh. That is his maqam. And Mu'adh broke down into tears, and our Prophet ﷺ said that, oh Mu'adh, this might be the last time that I see you. And Mu'adh is now already, in tears bawling away, and he says to Mu'adh, when you come back, perhaps you will not find me and you will find my qabr. Can you imagine how Mu'adh would have felt? And he's being told this. And that's exactly what happened when Mu'adh came back. The Prophet ﷺ had passed away. This is Mu'adh ibn Jabal. And now Mu'adh, in the 18th year of the Hijrah, he too and his family members, they all die a shaheed's death because of the plague, in the plague of Amwas. And his grave is also in that region as well. And he appointed Amr ibn al-As to become the leader. And in this time frame, over 25,000 of the Sahaba and the Muslims of the army passed away. 25,000. That is a massive number for an army that is already struggling to fight against the Byzantine Empire. And their graves are still scattered. And I myself have seen some of these graves when I visited Jordan and Bilad al-Sham and other places. And we see the graves of the Sahaba scattered in small villages here and there because of the plague of Amwas. They're camped in the various regions over there. Amr ibn al-As takes charge, and Amr ibn al-As is not anywhere near the level of Abu Ubaidah Amir ibn Jarrah or Mu'adh ibn Jabal. He is a Sahabi, and he is a Muhajir, and he is a great, worthy of indeed great honor and respect. But he is not to the level of Mu'adh in terms of maqam of the Sahaba, and he is not to the level of Abu Ubaidah Amir ibn Jarrah. But Amr ibn al-As, he was someone who was from the well-known people who was involved in leading, in politics, in siyasa, in control. And that's why when eventually Muawiyah became the Khalifa, Amr ibn al-As was his right-hand man. And Amr ibn al-As did a lot for the early Umayyad dynasty and empire that really benefited the dynasty. And he is called the statesman of the Arabs, the statesman of the Muslims. That this is the politician who knows how to run and rule. And that's Amr ibn al-As. When Amr ibn al-As came and took over, he stood up and he said that this disease that is happening or spreading over here, this is something that spreads like wildfire. And I advise you all to go and scatter in the hills and to basically, split up into smaller groups. And the companions, initially, some of them rejected this. One of them stood up and he got very angry at Amr ibn al-As, and he said that, I swear you are more misguided than my own donkey. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. And essentially he's accusing him of being a coward and doing something very ridiculous. And Amr ibn al-As, despite the fact that he was publicly insulted, despite the fact that he was the leader, but see, leaders, they have to bear with this type of insult. If you really want to bring about benefit and khair to the ummah, you have to have the bigger heart. You have to overlook this impetuous rashness that we find, common. It is very common. In the end of the day, this rashness is not going to do anything other than just, its air expelled from the lungs. People that are in charge and people that are senior in knowledge and in positions of leadership, they have to learn to have a thick skin and let the people do what they're doing. And Amr ibn al-As basically said to him, I shall not dignify, what you say with a response, meaning that that's your business. If you want to call me more misguided than a donkey, that's your business. I'm not going to punish you, let it be. I need to save lives, basically. I can't be involved in this pettiness. I need to save lives. And the policy was enacted. And rather than being congregated together, the Sahaba split up into smaller groups, and each one is now basically living in small camps and whatnot. And guess what? it did not have any negative impact. Rather, it saved the bulk of them. And when Umar ibn al-Khattab heard what Amr ibn al-As had done, he did not object to it at all. Means he tacitly approved of the policy of Amr ibn al-As. And this shows us, dear Muslims, and I mentioned this in a post on my Facebook as well, this shows us that the concept of breaking people up when there's a plague, what we now call social isolation, it was known to some of the Sahaba and they implemented it. It also shows us that some people are going to get overwhelmed, some people will react emotionally, some people are going to say things. Here, the leader, Amr ibn al-As, is publicly insulted. He's accused of being a misguided donkey by another famous person, and his name is known and whatnot, and he's also a Sahabi, and he's basically very angry. How dare you tell us to go and run into the hills and live separately? You're all stupid and dumb and foolish and whatnot. What is Amr going to do? He needs to save lives. He needs to save the army. He can't listen to this type of stuff. He said, look, you let you be. I need to save the people. And the policy was done, and that's what exactly ended up helping the community. Feelings don't save lives. Emotions don't save lives. Policies save lives. And those that are in charge, this is one of my main points of this entire lecture. You cannot be bogged down by people getting angry and irritated. Your goal, your duty is to effect the best policies to save lives, as Amr ibn al-As did. And also realize, and again this needs to be said, this solution was not given by Abu Ubaidah or Mu'adh radiallahu anhum, despite the fact that their maqam in Jannah is higher and they died the death of a shaheed, and may Allah Azza wa Jal bless them with Firdaus al-A'la, as inshallah they are in right now. But their policies, they didn't enact them. This policy came from someone who was not as senior to them in knowledge of Islam, nor in Iman and Taqwa. But Amr did have knowledge that the two of them did not have, and that is knowledge of siyasa, of politics, of leadership, of crowd control, of what is to be done as a military statesman, as a person in charge. That is where Amr came. And once again, I said this in my yesterday's talk, and I'll say it again. Taqwa and ilm of the Sharia is great in its place, but that is not the same as leadership for a community. That's not the same as politics. That's not the same as running and managing a corporation. Taqwa is one thing, and then having policies that are effective are something else. And the two are not necessarily, sometimes they are, not necessarily found in the same person. Abu Ubaidah and Mu'adh are higher in their maqam radiallahu anhum than Amr ibn al-As. But it was Amr ibn al-As who came with the solution that actually brought about some benefit in the armies of the Muslims in this time frame. Now, I also mentioned in my Facebook post yesterday that we don't know what happened to Jumu'ah and Jama'at, but it is reasonable to assume that if everybody's camping in smaller groups, it is reasonable to assume that they no longer had the communal Jumu'ah prayer that they would have had, because that would have defeated the purpose. Because literally the riwayah or the narration says, Amr said to them, "Tafarraqu," split up into smaller groups in the mountains and hills. Don't all congregate together. They had this knowledge that people all living together is going to spread the virus, is going to spread the plague. So Amr ibn al-As said, go split up into smaller groups. And they did that. And after a few weeks or months, when the viruses had basically gone away, so then they resumed their war against the Byzantine Empire. So this is the famous plague of Amwas or Amwas or Amawas or Imwas. All of these names are called. In English, it's Emmaus, E-M-M-A-U-S. It's a small little village in the modern country of Israel, but it is of course Bilad al-Sham and Palestine, according to our interpretation. And by the way, in the plague of Amwas, as we said, 25,000 Sahaba and people lost their lives. Not all of them were Sahaba, 25,000 people. Many of them were Sahaba. Many of them were senior Sahaba, Abu Ubaidah and Mu'adh amongst them. And Suhail ibn Amr, the famous Suhail that came in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, Suhail ibn Amr. And Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan, the older brother of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. And by the way, just a footnote here, Yazid was appointed by Umar ibn al-Khattab to be the governor of Damascus. As soon as Damascus was conquered, he sent Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan, the older brother of Muawiyah. Yazid died in the plague of Amwas. So Umar ibn al-Khattab then sent the younger brother, Muawiyah, to become the governor of Damascus. And of course, it was Allah's qadr that set the stage for the eventual establishment of the Umayyad Empire, because Muawiyah remained in Damascus and then eventually took over and eventually established the Umayyad dynasty, the power base of Syria and of Damascus. This was the plague of Amwas indirectly caused the power base to come to the Banu Umayyah, and then of course the Umayyad dynasty came, but that's a separate point that maybe perhaps one day I'll give a long lecture about Islamic history, but that's another topic altogether. Anyway, so this is the plague of Amwas. Now I'm going to skip over many other plagues that occurred regionally. There were many epidemics. If you read any classical book of history, Tarikh al-Tabari, or much later Ibn Kathir wrote his book, or you have Yaqut al-Hamawi, Mu'jam al-Buldan, you have many different treatises and history books written. And you cannot read a book of history except that you'll come across a number of plagues. For example, in the year 218 Hijrah, a plague affected Egypt and not a single household was unaffected. In fact, it is said that all the governors and leaders and statesmen died in 218 Hijrah in Egypt. In 228, that plague reached Azerbaijan, and they said that so many people died that they ran out of cloth to cover the bodies, and they could not bury the dead. In Basra as well, in the year 406, the plagues became so deadly that the graveyards were full and the bodies were basically in the streets for a few weeks. It is said that in some cases the entire family passed away, and they would simply just close the house, and that would be their burial for many months until the plagues finished. In the year 448 Hijrah, another plague swept through some lands, including Egypt and Andalus. And because of this, Imam al-Dhahabi mentions in his Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, you can look this up, volume 18, page 311, for those who are interested, because this is a very interesting quote here. Imam al-Dhahabi says that وقع في مصر والأندلس قحط ووباء كبير. There was a plague and a famine in Andalus and Masr that people never had seen before. حتى بقيت المساجد مغلقة بلا مصل, until the masajid remained shut without anybody praying in them. So this is very explicit here. In the year 448 Hijrah, the plague was so severe and the famine was so severe that the masajid were shut and not a single musalli remained in certain areas and lands. And this is explicitly mentioned in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala and other books as well. And there are many other incidents as well, but I want to jump to now, of course, the infamous Black Plague, or the Black Death, that swept through the 8th century of the Hijrah, corresponding to the 14th century of the Gregorian calendar, and it swept through the Mediterranean and Andalusia, and it affected the entire globe. Of course, the epicenter was Europe, but it affected the entire globe. As I said, this plague, the bubonic plague or the Black Plague, it was the greatest plague that recorded history has ever seen. And once again, in a number of regions, the plague was so severe. Let me quote you from the famous historian Al-Maqrizi, who writes in his book As-Suluk, volume 4, page 88, and I give these references because again, sometimes people doubt, like, oh my God, how can this be true? Look this up yourself. Al-Maqrizi writes in his Kitab As-Suluk on the Black Plague that occurred in the year 749 Hijrah, تعطل بسببه الأذان من عدة مواضع. In a number of regions, the adhan was stopped being given. People stopped giving adhan in entire regions. وبقي في الموضع المشهور بأذان واحد. And in the famous place that he's going to mention now, or he mentions it, only one adhan was given in the entire city. وأغلقت أكثر المساجد والزوايا. And the majority of masajid and the majority of monasteries where Sufis would gather together, they were closed down. They did not remain open. So Al-Maqrizi is saying the plague was so severe that the majority of masajid, and in some places all of the masajids in some regions, they were shut down. So this is something that is not new. Now, the issue of us being proactive is something that is new. It is true, because those people were being reactive. In those times, when it's too late, then they're reacting. We're trying to be proactive and shutting the masjids down before it gets to the level where there are no more musallin and we have to shut the masjid down. But the point is that it has happened in Islamic history that regions have had to shut masajid and stop the adhan because of the plagues that were happening. No doubt, and I'll be the first to say, I don't think it has ever happened to the global scale that we are witnessing now, but it is because we have more knowledge and we understand the reality of plagues and we're being proactive because of that. Now, back to my series of anecdotes here, that because of the Black Plague, a number of great scholars, they wrote books about plagues. And of them is Baha'u'ddin al-Subki. He wrote Qasida fi al-Ta'un, a poem about plagues. And this is in 1355. Another famous scholar, Ibn al-Wardi, he witnessed firsthand the Black Plague, the Black Death occur in his regions. And he was in Syria and he saw what's happening in Halab at the time. And he wrote about it in his Risalat al-Naba' an al-Waba, the treatise of telling you what is plagues. Risalat al-Naba' an al-Waba, basically. Naba' an al-Waba, the information about plagues. The famous scholar Ibn Hajar, of course, the greatest commentator of Sahih al-Bukhari, in the year 833 Hijrah, he lost 3 of his daughters to a plague that affected all of Egypt during the reign of Sultan Ashraf of the Mamluk era. And because of this, he wrote the encyclopedic work Badl al-Ma'un fi Fadl al-Ta'un. The Badl al-Ma'un fi Fadl al-Ta'un, it is an encyclopedia, over 400 pages. It is printed. You can buy it in classical bookstores, and bookstores that sell classical works, You can buy it in the bookstores that have these types of books, and it is a very big treatise, 400 pages. It's an encyclopedic work that covers many aspects, the theology of plagues, where plagues come from, what to do in times of plagues, the ahadith about plagues, the fiqh of plagues. And this is a very interesting book that maybe, again, Allah knows what my future lectures are going to be, but maybe we'll summarize this book in another lecture. I don't know, we'll see. In any case, some of the takeaways from this book, Badl al-Ma'un fi Fadl al-Ta'un of Ibn Hajar, and he wrote this book, subhanAllah, what an alim, what a genius. His family has died. He's seen 3 of his daughters die. How does he react? He takes that grief and he channels it to write one of the best books the world has ever seen about the fiqh of plagues. Look at this, the mindset, subhanAllah, of these great ulama. In any case, so of the things that we can derive from this book, that he mentions, he has chapters, that plagues are a mercy for the believers. Plagues are a mercy for the believers and a punishment unto others. And he mentions the famous hadith which is in Sahih Bukhari, that the Prophet ﷺ was asked about ta'un, and ta'un is the Arabic word for plague. And the Prophet ﷺ said that the ta'un, it is an adhab upon whomever Allah wants, and it is a rahmah that Allah has made for the believers. So this is our theological understanding of plagues. It is an adhab. Notice, by the way, he did not say an adhab on all kuffar. He did not say this, our Prophet ﷺ. He said, it is an adhab on whomever Allah wants it to be. And it is a rahmah for the believers. So this underscores our mentality. Dear Muslims, all that is happening around us now, we need to understand this as being a rahmah for the mu'min. And we ask Allah that we are amongst the mu'minin. We want it to be a rahmah, even as we suffer some of the pains and the pinches and the consequences. In our heart of hearts, our attitude is, whatever is happening, there's a greater wisdom, and in the end it will be a rahmah for me. Also, Ibn Hajar mentions that he has chapters here about those who die in the plague, and of course these chapters are very emotional, very powerful, because of course he's lost 3 of his own family members. And of course he has in this the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that anyone who remains in a land of plagues and he stays there sabiran muhtasiban, patient, expecting the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing that nothing will happen except whatever Allah has willed it to happen, then if he dies, he shall die the death of a shaheed. And Ibn Hajar mentions therefore the famous, we all know this, inshallah, I hope we all know this now, that whoever dies because of the plague with iman and taqwa, that death will be considered the death of a shaheed. And this is a great blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it is also a comfort and a consolation that Ibn Hajar felt much consoled that my daughters, my family members have died the death of a shaheed. And he also mentions many chapters about the issue of running away from plagues, fleeing from plagues. And of course the famous hadith, which is the hadith of Abu Ubaidah and Umar and Abdurrahman ibn Auf, that if you hear of a plague in another land, don't go there. And if you're in that land, don't run away from it. And then he mentions that when is this hadith applicable and when is it not applicable. And he actually ends up concluding, and this is the opinion, by the way, of the vast majority of ulama, that it is allowed to travel to and from such lands if there are pressing reasons to do so. What you're not allowed to do, when the plague has come to your land, you run away in cowardice and fear, thinking that running away will save you. That is haram. But Ibn Hajar mentions, and after him as-Suyuti, and before him other scholars as well, if you're in a land and you have a genuine reason to go somewhere, for example, to protect your family, for example, for medical treatment somewhere else, and so you leave one land to another land for legitimate reason, Ibn Hajar says, this hadith does not apply to you. Now, should you leave? Should you not leave? This also goes back to the experts of our times, and we listen to the medical experts. But the point is that if we are in an epicenter where our experts have said this is an epicenter of disease, and we are told we should not travel, to flee thinking that running away from it is going to protect us, that is obviously going against what our Prophet ﷺ said. Now, one final point of this book before we move on to the next the next issue, and this is somewhat problematic, but it needs to be said. Ibn Hajar has many chapters discussing the issue of diseases being contagious or not. And was it 2 or 3 weeks ago, you can log on and check on my channel and the Epics channel as well, the YouTube channel, I gave an entire Q&A about trying to explain the hadith La Adwa, that there is no contagion. La Adwa, wala tirata, wala hammata, wala safar. The Prophet ﷺ negated 4 things. The first of them, Adwa. And Adwa, what does it mean? I mentioned in that Q&A, please listen to it, I'm not going to summarize it all over again, that people have differed about what this means, and one group of ulama said that La Adwa means there's no such thing as contagion, i.e. there's no such thing as diseases being contagious. And if somebody who's sick is in the vicinity of somebody who's healthy, and the one who's healthy becomes sick, it has nothing to do with the one who was sick before. It just so happened, it was Allah's qadr, it was a coincidence. One should not assume that the sick person has anything inherently that will cause a healthy person to be sick. And this is an interpretation of, and I mentioned in my Q&A, when I gave it, many ulama, and Ibn Hajar is also one of them in this regard, and also many famous ulama before, such as At-Tahawi and Ibn Qutaybah and others, they all held the view that what this hadith means is that there's no such thing as contagious diseases, and that a sick person in and of himself does not carry anything that is inherently going to make a healthy person sick, and so we should negate this completely. And Ibn Hajar also felt that if there is any causality, it's not because of the sick person. Rather, Ibn Hajar said this is because of the effects of the jinn. So he felt that jinns are the ones that are carrying the disease onto other entities or other people, and so we should understand it from that standpoint. Of course, that is his opinion, and that's the opinion of some of the classical ulama. In my Q&A that I gave, I actually mentioned that's not the only opinion, and there are a number of scholars that said, no, this hadith actually does not mean that there's no such thing as contagious diseases. They interpreted the hadith separately, and they said that this negates a pre-Islamic superstition that diseases are inherently bad luck around other people. And I mentioned that in the Q&A, you can listen to it over there, and I said that that is inshallah the correct interpretation. Now, that might be indeed the correct interpretation. It doesn't change the fact that many of our great ulama, including Ibn Hajar, including At-Tahawi and others, they had different interpretations, and they did not believe that diseases are inherently contagious. And that's something that needs to be said, even though it is awkward to say, because once again, this interpretation is simply not correct. We know that diseases are if Allah wills them to be contagious, they are contagious. It's basically sabab and asbab. There are things that cause diseases to spread, and of them is sick people being in the vicinity of healthy people. And this is something that is well known. And we did have doctors and scientists from within the lands of Islam clearly mentioning that diseases are contagious. This is well known as well. Some of the greatest scientists and doctors that the lands of Islam produced, they wrote treatises on medicine. They wrote treatises on contagious diseases and on plagues, and all of them, almost without exception, they affirmed that contagion is real and contagious diseases can affect other people. So we have, for example, Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, who died 923 CE, and Thabit ibn Qurra, who died 901 CE. They both wrote treatises regarding contagious diseases, regarding plagues, and they mentioned that things like leprosy and others, they are inherently contagious, and that if a person who has leprosy or a person who has a contagious disease is brought in the vicinity of a healthy person, then it will affect by nature of some issue between them. And this is something Ibn Sina as well in his Qarun and others, they mention this in the medicinal books, that this is something that is well known. Now, were all of our scholars against the issue of against the theology of contagious diseases? No. Many of our ulama, they tried to reconcile what they knew of medicine with these ahadith that some ulama interpreted to negate contagious diseases. And Ibn al-Qayyim is one of those ulama, and he has a very detailed discussion in his famous book Zad al-Ma'ad. And for the advanced students, you can look it up in my edition, the famous edition. It is volume 4, page 35 to 42. You can look this up and have a detailed discussion. And I'm not going to summarize it because it is a bit too advanced for our lecture here. I just want to say that if you read this, what you will find Ibn al-Qayyim is doing, Ibn al-Qayyim quotes the medicinal experts of his time frame. He quotes the doctors of his time frame, and he then quotes these ahadith, and he tries to synthesize them. He makes a theory that in hindsight, with what we know now, it is obviously wrong because his knowledge of medicine is obviously coming from a different time frame. But what I'm more interested in is not what Ibn al-Qayyim said. What I'm interested in is his paradigm. What I'm interested in is what we call usul. What sources and what was his methodology? Ibn al-Qayyim understood that we need to go to the experts in the field. And he looked at the experts in the field. Now, in the time frame, and I'm not going to go into the history of medicine, but those of you that know that there were outdated theories back then, coming primarily from Galen, the famous ancient doctor of the Hellenistic empires. Galen had certain theories of the humors of the body and whatnot. And by the way, our Indian Pakistani people, they know Tibb Yunani, right? The Hakim medicine. This comes from Galen. That's from that strand that goes back over there. And Galen had his notions and theories that somehow these types of diseases, they transfer from what is called bad air. So, I mean, again, I'm being simplistic, I'm not being technical, so please don't jump on me, oh critics, you want to criticize some phrase, you just be a bit more broad-minded. I'm trying to educate people. When you educate people, you need to teach in a manner that people can understand. What Galen believed was that essentially a person has something called bad air. And by this he meant like the ambience around the person, not virus, not microbes, but basically they're going to be absorbing just the vibe or whatnot around the person, and that is going to cause the disease to transfer over. Now, what Ibn al-Qayyim is saying, he's trying to synthesize what the scientists and the medical experts are saying with what the hadith is saying. And what he is saying is that the scientists, they're talking about one world, which is the knowledge of his, the knowledge of experience and of material. And the Quran and Sunnah is talking about ilm al-ghayb. And of course, ultimate authority is given to Quran and Sunnah, but he manages in his own way to find a way out to interpret these ahadith in light of the knowledge of medicine at that time. And in his other work, Miftah Dar al-Sa'ada, Ibn al-Qayyim clearly argues that there is such a thing as contagious diseases. And he goes against what many ulama before him said, and he says, no, we have to understand there is such a thing as contagion, but the hadith means something else. And he then has, of course, the version that I also mentioned in my longer Q&A. And he's not alone in this regard. a number of other ulama, they clearly had different interpretations. And of them is the polymath and the vizier and the politician Ibn al-Khatib. Ibn al-Khatib, who died in the year 776 Hijrah or 1374 CE. Ibn al-Khatib, he wrote a book, مقنعات السائل عن المرض الهائل. And this book translates as answering the difficult questions regarding the very evil disease, meaning the Black Plague, answering the very difficult questions regarding the very evil disease, عن المرض الهائل. And in this book, by the way, Ibn al-Khatib, he was an alim, a historian. He lived in Andalusia. He was a minister for the Nasheed dynasty of Granada. We were just there, for some of us in my group, we were just there last week. We saw the remnants of the Nasheed dynasty. And Ibn al-Khatib was one of those people who was an alim and a historian and a person of great intellect. And he writes this book about the Black Plague and what's happening over here. Now, Ibn al-Khatib says, and he writes from his book, he says that one principle that cannot be ignored is that if our experience and our senses clearly indicate something, and a text that we find indicates, another interpretation, we cannot ignore observation, and we have to interpret what we know to be true. We have to interpret it in the light of our facts. And he then mentions that in the issue of contagion, we can observe this to be a reality. It is hissi. It is something we know, that a sick person transmits the disease to healthy people. And therefore, we cannot interpret the hadith la adwa to mean there's no such thing as contagious diseases. Rather, we need to interpret it in another manner. And he then, of course, goes into the interpretation. I also, by the way, the same interpretation I said in my lecture is the same thing that Ibn al-Khatib said as well. So I'm not the only one. Many ulama have said this. Now, he then says, to summarize, this is him saying, to summarize, wabil jumla, to play deaf, to ignore that contagion is a reality, this ignorance, it is something that is blasphemous, and it is something that will consider and damage the lives of Muslims. If we ignore that diseases are contagious and we say that there's no such thing as contagious diseases, we are playing deaf, dumb and blind to the reality, and we're going to follow a position that will cheapen and harm Muslims. Muslims will die if we follow this wrong opinion. And he said, this is Ibn al-Khatib saying, a group of pious people in North Africa and the Maghrib have changed their minds, testifying that their previous fatwas were wrong. And they now say that there is such a thing as contagious diseases because they understood their previous fatwa made the lives of Muslims cheap and harmed them and caused them to destroy themselves. And Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran that you should not destroy yourself. So may Allah protect us from such nonsense and grant us success in both speech and action. End quote. Now, dear Muslims, Ibn al-Khatib is saying there were some ulama who gave fatwas because of the Black Plague. Those fatwas caused people to die. They didn't take into account that diseases are contagious. They had a theoretical, abstract, religious opinion that was devoid of validity. It didn't take into account modern knowledge. Because of their opinion, people died. They realized their opinions were wrong when it was too late. And they retracted, and alhamdulillah they retracted, but the damage had been done. This is Ibn al-Khatib writing because of the Black Plague. You all understand where I'm going with this. We all understand we cannot ignore reality. Iman and taqwa is one thing, and ruling over groups of people and having policies is something else. Policies don't come from Iman and taqwa. Policies come, good policies, they come from experience. And it is possible that a person of less Iman and taqwa, frankly, it is possible that a person of no Iman and taqwa has a more effective policy because he or she knows policies better, because Iman and taqwa is one thing and policies is something else. Ibn al-Khatib was not the most famous alim of his time. There were many more famous ulama, but Ibn al-Khatib hit the nail on the head when he said said those ulama were wrong in their fatwa. Because of their fatwa, people lost lives and they realized it too late, but alhamdulillah, at least they did realize it. And he literally says, and you can read this passage in his book, مقنعة السائل عن المرض الهائل, you can literally read it in his book. He literally says that those fatwas were akin to telling them to commit suicide. And Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran, don't be the cause of your own destruction. وَلَا تُلْقُوا بِأَيْدِكُمْ إِلَى التَّهْلُكَةِ. Don't cause your own destruction with your own policies. This is Ibn al-Khatib writing in the era of the Black Plagues. Let's quickly fast forward, and I know time is also coming up, and maybe inshallah if you guys can put in the comments or footnotes if you really are interested in this stuff, I don't mind going into more detail, but I feel very strongly about this, and I want to be very clear here, but I'll say that at the conclusion. One other anecdote or issue, obviously let's fast forward to pre-modern times in the 18th, 19th century, the early 20th century, with the advent of modernity, with the advent of interacting with Europeans and the colonization powers, and you see now modern science, you see modern medicine, and you still have, of course, them ruling over us in the colonized lands. We now see once again a similar tension taking place. It's not the only time. Throughout our history, we've seen this small tensions between two opposing groups or camps, and one of them might have a lot of iman and taqwa. Great, good for them. But iman and taqwa does not in and of itself save lives through policy. You have to have good policy. And we find this issue over and over again. Let's talk about one or two other cases before we conclude. And of them is that another plague erupted in Algeria in the middle of the 19th century. And Algeria at this time, as you should all be aware, Algeria was occupied by the French in, was it 1832, whatever the date is, but Algeria came in and occupied, France came in and occupied Algeria. And the French are now ruling over Algeria. And a mini plague, not a pandemic of the world, but an epidemic, because plagues happen all the time. It did occur in France. And once again, we found groups of ulama with different positions about what is to be done. I am interested in a particular alim by the name of Hamdan ibn Uthman Khoja. Hamdan ibn Uthman Khoja, who died 1842. And Hamdan was an Algerian alim who was a faqih, and he was trained in Hanafi law, and he studied in Ottoman lands and Istanbul, and he came back an alim and a sheikh. He then lived in France for a while and learned French and saw the people of the customs and what, and he came back and he became a very famous person, not just for Islamic knowledge but for advocating the rights for Algerian Muslims. So he's trying to fight for the rights of fight here meaning within the framework, fight within the law for the rights of Algerian Muslims. Now, there is an issue that happened, that there was a plague that is taking place and in Algeria at the time, and he wrote a treatise called اتحاف المنصفين والأدباء في الاحتراز عن الوباء, and that is basically a gift to those people that are fair and those people that are of letters, of intelligence, that we should quarantine people when there is a plague going on. What is going on here? So the French, by this time, Europeans have discovered there's something called quarantine. When somebody is sick, you pull them away from their families, you pull them away from other people, and you put them in a special place, a special hospital, away from the people. A quarantine is something that by now Europeans are well aware of and they are adopting. But the Muslims were not happy at this. How can you take somebody away from his family, from his wife and children? This is a person, he needs the love of his family. How can you take somebody away from the community? He's not going to be praying in his masjid anymore. You're going to put him in a place that is far away. This is an injustice. This is a type of imprisonment. What has he done? They would say. And so he wrote a treatise that is arguing against the ulama who are saying we should not put people in quarantine. And this treatise, he writes it and he's over 60 years old. And so he basically is very emotional here in this treatise because once again, he needs to save lives here. He has seen the effects of the plague, of the epidemic. He has seen what happens when you quarantine people. And he wants to now make his case to his fellow ulama that, hey guys, you need to follow this practice of quarantining people. Now, what were his other ulama or some, and again, This tension is nothing new, dear Muslims. It's been there from the beginning. It will remain forever. This is the reality. And my message here is to those of you that are in positions of policy. You need to make decisions. Look at what the ulama are saying and then go with the camp of ulama, go with the camp of scholars whose opinions agree with that of the experts on the field. And don't let emotions cloud you, and don't let the anger of those that are on the maybe even more pious side, don't let that anger get to you, because you need to save lives here. You're always going to find ulama that are with the understanding of what it needs to be done, and you're going to find the other group as well. So he writes this book here. I'm going to summarize it for you. And he basically has 9 principles that he wants everybody to understand. And by the way, in the introduction, he basically says, guys, listen, I'm a good Muslim. I'm a faithful Muslim. I'm a person who observes the prayer. I'm paraphrasing, but he's basically saying, I follow mainstream aqeedah. I'm not some crazy lunatic here. I believe in Islam. I believe in Allah. He's a trained alim, by the way. He's trained in Hanafi law. He trained in the lands of the Ottoman lands. Now he's come back. Everybody knows him, but he needs to prove his credentials and points. And he mentions 9 things. I'm going to go over them very quickly. He says, number 1, Allah created everything, both the good and the bad. Number 2, Allah created things to be causes to other things. Allah created the cause and the effect of the cause and the connection between the cause. So there's nothing wrong with affirming causality. There's nothing wrong with saying that a virus causes the disease. Allah created the virus, and Allah created the disease that is created by the virus. Allah created the virus, and Allah created the effects of the virus. The fact that the virus causes the disease does not negate the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because again, the other ulama were saying Allah is in charge of everything. He's saying, of course Allah is in charge of everything, but Allah is telling us that certain things cause another thing. That if you light fire onto this cloth over here, it's gonna burn. Allah created the fire to light things. It doesn't mean that, the fire is all powerful instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number 3, he says, Allah has decreed that death and danger are to be avoided. Allah is not telling us to be foolish. Allah is not telling us to walk into our debts. Allah wants us to protect ourselves from death and danger, and medicine is one of those things that protects us from death and danger. Number 4, he said that tawakkul is indeed important, but it is spiritual. Tawakkul has nothing to do with taking the asbab. And of course we all inshallah know this. Number 5, he said, and this is really important, the knowledge of the cause and effects is not always found in the Sharia. It can also be found from human experience. In other words, viruses and where they come from, and diseases and how to contain them. This is knowledge that we can discover ourselves. It doesn't have to be found in the Quran and Sunnah. We can discover it from other sources. And then I'm not going to mention all of them, time is limited. Point number 7, he mentions that, and he's writing this, by the way, in 1830 something. Number 7, he says, the Europeans have attained superior knowledge to us in the natural sciences and in medicine, whereas we have better knowledge in the religious sciences. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with taking the knowledge of the Europeans and applying it to us when it is effective. And this is an important point, because one of the points that the ulama of Algeria were saying, they were saying, where'd you get this knowledge from? Quarantine. Who told you about quarantine? Is it found in the books of fiqh? Did any alim give a fatwa about quarantine? Quote me a shaykh that says you should take somebody away from his family and put him in a faraway place. And our alim here, Hamdan, is saying that, listen, just because it hasn't, Hamdan al-Khoja is his name, Hamdan al-Khoja, that just because it's not found in a classical book doesn't mean anything. This is knowledge that we can discover on our own, and we know that quarantine works. So just because the Europeans have discovered it doesn't mean we cannot apply it in Algeria. Then point number 8, he says, and now he's addressing the political powers. He said, listen, you in charge, or you who in charge, do not be persuaded by the emotionalism and, he says, the fanaticism of the ignorant. You have to put policies that are going to protect the living. That's your responsibility. You're going to have to ignore what these people are saying when it's wrong. Don't be persuaded by their emotionalism. That's not what you need to do. And he then concludes his point number 9 by saying that the Europeans have demonstrated that quarantine works. We know it is effective. Just because Muslims didn't discover this doesn't mean it has no basis in Islam. It works. We can take it from the Europeans and we can apply it. And this is an alim who is basically understanding what is going on, and he is appealing to his other ulama that, hey, look guys, just because we don't find it in the classical textbook doesn't make it wrong. It is something that needs to be done. Now, there were ulama who opposed him, and that is the reality. What are you going to do? You're always going to have these two opinions. And one final opinion as well, one final anecdote, and then inshallah we are done for today. And I apologize for the length, but again, this needs to be said. And I mean, all of today I was going back and forth with people that are angry that how dare I say something, it's automatically implying my position, which is to, at least in these lands, to close the masjid and whatnot. It contradicts the position of their Shaykh, they said. Because it contradicts the position and their Shaykh is older than me and more senior than me, this implies I'm disrespecting the Shaykh. And I said, no, I'm not disrespecting at all. Some of my own teachers that I love and I consider to be better than me, they held views about the modern world and about science that were just wrong, just plain incorrect. That doesn't negate the fact that they're better than me and they have more knowledge than me when it comes to many aspects of fiqh and many aspects of aqeedah. But with my utmost love to them and respect to them, they did not know the sciences of this dunya as much as somebody who's born and raised in another land. I have a degree in engineering. My mind is different. I understand science in a different way, and they understand many aspects in a different way. The fact that I hold a different position than them is in no sense a disrespect, but this notion of emotionalism, it's not just becoming right now because of Twitter and Facebook. Go back to the time of Amr ibn al-As when he is accused, you're worse than a donkey because this is running away. Go back to the time of many other of the earlier people. Go back to the time of Ibn al-Khatib when the scholars are basically saying, what are you saying about contagious diseases? Go back to the time of Algeria now when they say to Khoja Sahab over here is that you're taking this from the French. This means you don't have tawakkul in Allah, and he has to defend himself. I'm a believer. I believe in Allah. This is tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'll mention one final anecdote as well, that in the time of Sultan Mahmud III, in the 1840s as well, a plague of cholera, it struck Muslim lands, in the lands of the Ottoman lands. And once again, we have a little bit of this tension over here as well that took place. But the Ottoman Sultan ignored the cries of those who were saying we should not quarantine, and he established what is called the Imperial Council of Health, which did take many of its policies from European models of quarantine, and it did implement them in Islamic lands, and it proved far more effective than other policies. And one other example as well, I said that'll be the last one, but again, so much needs to be done here, that half a century later, another plague broke out in Morocco, and in the 1890s, the Sultan of Morocco, he once again wanted to implement the policy of quarantine. If somebody is sick, any symptoms are observed, take him out of his city, take him out of his house, and take him to a separate place and put him in there by force. But you understand what quarantine is in those days. The guy would not want to leave, he wants to be with his family. No, the police are going to come, or the army is going to come and say, hey, look, for the betterment of all of us, you have to get out and you have to be living in that camp over there. That's a type of punishment, but it's not a punishment. Let me rephrase here. It's not a punishment. You get my point. The person is going to feel deprived. The person is going to feel this is forced jail time. Nobody wants to go into quarantine, but the Europeans were doing it for over 100 years. Quarantine comes from an Italian word, by the way, to sequester for 40 days. The word quarantine, that the Italians came across this in the 1700s, basically 100 years before this, where sailors would come from ships, and if they were sick, the Italians would take them and put them for 40 days. Quarantine comes from 40 days by yourself, and so they would put them into 40 days. This proved to be effective. The science has developed, the French are doing it, and now it is being introduced to Muslim lands. And you have many ulama who said, no, this is from the kuffar. And I'm not exaggerating, but that's exactly what they said. This is from the kuffar, we cannot take this. And other ulama said, even if it is from the kuffar, so what? It's not knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah, it is knowledge of medicine. Why cannot we take it? So one other issue broke out as well, and this is in the 1890s, that the Sultan of Morocco, he wanted to implement a policy of quarantining sick people, and many of the ulama, they were opposed to this. and they accused the Sultan. The Sultan was not popular. Generally, politicians are never popular. I'm not defending the Sultan at all. I really don't know his political policies. I don't know what he did or didn't do, but he was not popular with the people for many reasons. When the plague erupted, he said, we need to quarantine the sick people. The ulama, many of them, not all, many of them said, you are a puppet of the French. Now, he might have been, I don't know, I'm not knowledgeable of that. You are a puppet of the French, and you're taking this notion of quarantine and you're implementing it from the policies of the kuffar. This is something coming from them, and it's not from our sharia, and we oppose this. Well, as usual, once again, we find ulama that are not, and here's the point, this is the blessing of Allah. Whenever you find groups of ulama differing about an area that is not 100% classical theology or 100% issues of fiqh that don't deal with modernity, you find them differing about medicine, about this, about that, go with the ulama who seem to be in conformity with what everybody outside of that field of classical Islam and in the field of their whatever the issue might be are saying. And this is a classic example over here. Another alim comes along, and his name is Ahmad ibn Khalid al-Nasiri, and he writes a treatise or a fatwa in which another alim comes along, and he says that what the Sultan is doing is valid. Now let me rephrase. Ahmad ibn Khalid al-Nasiri was a great alim who opposed the issue of quarantine. I flipped it around. Al-Nasiri wrote a fatwa that said that the Sultan is wrong in effecting quarantine, and the Sultan is following the laws of the kuffar and taking this from France, and it is not allowed for Muslims to be quarantined based upon what the French are doing, because this is not something that is found in our sources. It is something that is found in European sources. And of course we understand that at the time, put yourself in the shoes of the Algerian and the Moroccan people. They were very angry at the French. The French had done many things. I mean, just read what the French did in Algeria and the North Africa, and you would understand the level of hatred and anger that is there. Now, the French are doing all of these human rights abuses. Quarantine is coming from the French. What do you think many ulama are going to do? Al-Nasiri was one of the most famous. I had it mistaken when I said this. He did not implement quarantine, he opposed it. And he wrote a fatwa saying that the Sultan is doing something that is haram and sinful by imposing quarantine on the people, because this is not something that Islam allows to do. So the point of all of this is, to summarize and to conclude, the point of all of this is, from the very beginning, since the time of the Sahaba, when Umar al-Khattab was wanting to enter, radiallahu anhu, wanting to enter Bilad al-Sham, we find there's been some tension, some differences of opinion about how we should deal with contagious diseases, how we even understand contagious diseases. What are plagues? What is the origin of plagues? And to what extent can one benefit from knowledge and experience of the outsiders? Should we just accept the qadr of Allah and do nothing? And many of our senior Sahaba did that. Or should we do something and be proactive? And Amr ibn al-As did that. And you had some ulama, many ulama, dare I say perhaps the majority in earlier time frames, who actually denied the concept of contagious diseases. They actually said there's no such thing as diseases being contagious. And if a sick person and a healthy person interact together and the healthy person becomes sick, the sick person's presence did not in any way, shape or form cause the sickness of the other. It's simply a coincidence, a qadr of Allah, that it just so happened that the two of them were in the same vicinity. You had some ulama saying it is the jinn that are involved, and the jinn are the ones who transfer the disease from one entity to another. And then you had another group of ulama, and these ulama, they're trying to reconcile, they're trying to bring about, look, we know what the Quran and Sunnah says, we accept Allah and His Messenger's statement, we're believers, but we also have experience, and we have what doctors and scientists are saying, and let's see if we can find a balance and see if they come together. And I would say very clearly Ibn al-Qayyim is one of those. Ibn al-Khatib is one of those. Hamdan Khoja is one of those. That they're looking at what's going on, and Ibn al-Khatib is saying, hey guys, you cannot be deaf, dumb and blind. You cannot just cover your eyes and ignore that diseases are contagious because you misunderstand the hadith. He is saying, fact teaches us that your understanding must be wrong. Let's go back and reinterpret the hadith. And if you listen to my Q&A that I gave 2-3 weeks ago, and you can listen to it online, how do we understand the hadith of contagion? This is Ibn al-Khatib's understanding. It is not the understanding of Ibn Hajar. It is not the understanding of Tahawi. It is not the understanding of ulama that frankly are more famous and well known than Ibn al-Khatib. But with my utmost love and respect to those great ulama, and I'm sorry for saying this so bluntly, they were wrong in that understanding. Diseases are contagious if Allah wills them to be. There is something that inherently causes a sick person to harm a healthy person if Allah Azza wa wills. In the end, everything is Allah is musabbibul asbab, but Allah created asbab. And one thing is linked to another. And that linkage is discovered by common sense, by knowledge, by experience, by experiments. And if a kafir discovers the linkage, it doesn't make the linkage haram or bid'ah or kufr or anything to do. We still understand that linkage and we affirm it. And listen, I'll be honest with you here. I mean, we're dealing with this for the last 2-3 days, and all of today I was going back and forth on Facebook and Twitter and whatnot, and really it's frustrating, and I have to remind myself of what Ibn al-Khatib said and of what Hamdan Khoja said, is that leaders need to ignore the anger and the frustration because they need to save lives. Leaders need to just ignore that, be kind and gentle, and they are sincere people. They think they're defending the correct interpretation. They think it is a matter of iman and kufr, but that's their view. Inshallah, I'm a believer in Allah and His Messenger. I believe in La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. I pray 5 times a day. I memorize the Quran. I'm not negating anything when I say that diseases are contagious, when I say that we should implement quarantines to our realistic possibilities. We should take the advice of our experts and our doctors. And I sympathize with people like Amr ibn al-As, who radiallahu anhu had to hear people call him a donkey and still said, you know what, I'm sorry, I don't have time for you. I need to save lives here. I need to have policies put into place here. Throughout our history, we've had this tension, and we still have it today. Dear people in charge of communities, dear people who are effecting policies, please do not allow emotionalism to sway you. Don't be harsh. Don't be nasty. Understand that these are people, they love Islam. They love Allah and His Messenger. But that love of Allah and His Messenger does not in and of itself translate into correct policy. Correct policies have to do with empirical evidence. They have to do with what we know of this dunya. And sometimes some of our ulama, they might be better than many of us in their ilm and their ibadah and their taqwa. They might be better than, but in and of itself, taqwa does not tell us technical policies. In and of itself, piety doesn't bring about policy. You can be more muttaqi, but you can be wrong in the opinion you hold about what needs to be done for this dunya. And so as we conclude today's lecture and talk, I reiterate to everybody here, please, tensions are at an all-time high. I understand people are very emotional and they want to follow their ulama and whatever mufti so-and-so said and shaykh so-and-so says. May Allah Azza wa Jal give you more iman and taqwa, give me more iman and taqwa. Your mufti and shaykh is not a medical expert. I am not a medical expert. Go to the medical experts. And if you find a group of ulama giving fatwas that agree with the medical experts, choose that group of ulama who are agreeing with the medical experts. And this is what we find in history as well. And dare I say, not only is this the more correct position in terms of what we look at historically or not, it is definitely not just the wisest, the correct opinion in terms of how we need to go about managing the affairs of today. Dear Muslims, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide all of us to that which is pleasing and correct. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all hikmah and wisdom in these testing and trying times ahead of us. This is not going to be the only issue that's going to be happening about closing the masajid and closing whatnot. There's going to be many other issues that we might potentially be facing. If that is the case, that you find groups of ulama with differences of opinion and you find the experts in medicine pretty much unanimously agreed, go with those ulama that are agreeing with the experts and love and respect the other camp, and know that it is very possible that the other camp has more iman and taqwa and they might have a higher maqam in the eyes of Allah. It doesn't make their policies correct. Policies and siyasa is not based upon taqwa. It's based upon knowledge of the fields that one is dealing with, and that is a separate science altogether. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us to that which is correct and beneficial, and may Allah azza wa jal use us to guide other people. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep our hearts united, keep our hearts pure. May Allah azza wa jal grant us the best of akhlaq so that we rise above any type of irritation or frustration. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all to be role models of piety and iman and taqwa. ربنا لا تجعلنا فتنة للذين ظلموا يا ربنا. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His tawfiq and ikhlas, and to protect us and our families from all that we're about to face. And with that, insha'Allah ta'ala, I will conclude, and perhaps another day we'll do Q&A. Time is already too late, so there's no time for Q&A. So with that, jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
لا يزال الخير حيا لا يزال إن في الدنيا سلاما وظلال أخبر الأيام أنها في وصال قم بنا وانظر لآيات الجمال قم بنا وانظر لآيات الجمال